Every man who's been burned in Angeles City has a speech. You hear it at the bar counters, at the expat breakfast tables, in the Facebook groups that exist specifically to warn the next wave of newcomers. The speech always starts the same way. The first one cost me, and here's what I learned. The speech is sincere. The man giving it means every word. What the speech never mentions, what none of them mention, is that the lesson doesn't protect you from the second one, because the second one doesn't look like the first one. That's the entire mechanism. And Barry Callahan, who gave that speech more times than he can count, learned this the hard way, in the most expensive classroom in Angeles City. This is what it looks like when your own lesson decides not to apply to you. The first thing you need to know is that I am not a stupid man. I want to say that at the start, because by the time I finish telling you what happened, you're going to wonder, and I'd rather address it directly. I drove long haul for 31 years out of Phoenix. Tucson to Los Angeles, Phoenix to Denver, the I-40 corridor from Flagstaff to Amarillo and back again, more times than I could count. Long-haul trucking will not make you stupid. What it will do is leave you alone with your thoughts for stretches of 8, 10, 14 hours at a time, and alone with your thoughts is where a man either builds something solid in his head or starts filling the space with things that feel solid but aren't. I'd been divorced from my wife Pamela for 9 years by the time I retired. Our son Travis lived in Scottsdale and called on his birthday and sometimes Christmas. Pamela had remarried a man named Greg, who sold insurance, and seemed, from the limited information I had, to be genuinely decent, which I found more irritating than I would have found the alternative. I retired at 62, on a combination of savings, Social Security, and the money from selling my rig, which I'd owned outright since 2017. The total was comfortable by Phoenix standards, and significantly more comfortable by Angeles City standards, which is why I ended up in Angeles City. I want to be fair about how I got there. It wasn't the bars. I know that's hard to believe given how the story ends, but it's true. A man I'd known for 20 years, a retired cop named Gary Stinson, who'd moved to the Philippines 2 years before me, had told me about the country in a way that didn't emphasize walking street at all. He talked about the weather and the cost, and the fact that his dollar went further there than anywhere he'd ever been, and the people were friendly and the food was good, and a man could live without watching every cent for the first time in his adult life. That's what got me on the plane. The bars were a thing I discovered after I arrived, the way you discover a neighborhood's character once you've moved in. The first one's name I don't say anymore. I decided that about a year after it ended, as a practical measure, the fewer times I said her name, the fewer times I had to think about her, and thinking about her had an unpleasant tendency to shade into thinking about the $40,000. She found me in month 2 of my first year in Angeles City. I was at a bar on Fields Avenue, which is the main entertainment strip, drinking a beer by myself and watching a basketball game on a screen above the bar, in the way that a man watches something he's not actually watching, because the point is to have somewhere to rest your eyes while your mind does other things. She sat down next to me, and within 45 minutes I had bought her 3 drinks and gotten her number, and told myself that things were different here, which every man in every bar in Angeles City has told himself since approximately the beginning of time. I won't go into the full detail of how that one went, because it's not really the story I'm trying to tell. The version that matters is this. Over the following 8 months she was in my life in a way that felt real while it was happening, and felt constructed once it was over, and the $40,000 went out in amounts that ranged from a few hundred to several thousand, for reasons that always had a document or an explanation attached, and that I always had a reason to accept, and that I now understand were the standard curriculum of a professional relationship that I had mistaken for something else. When it ended, abruptly, in the way these things tend to end, with a phone that stopped being answered, and a story that fell apart at the seams once you pulled on any single thread, I went through what I can only describe as an accelerated education. I read everything I could find. I talked to other men who'd been through it. I sat in Gary Stinson's apartment one evening, and Gary, who had been through his own version in his second year, walked me through the mechanics of it in the dry, forensic way that retired cops walk you through things, the way that takes all the emotion out and leaves just the structure. I understood the structure. I understood it completely. And then I met Daisy. This is the part I need to explain carefully, because if I just say I met a bar girl and spent $95,000 on her, that sounds like the same story with a bigger number. It isn't the same story. That's the whole point. If it had been the same story, I'd have seen it coming, because I had the map of the first story memorized. The second story was different in almost every surface detail, which is why the same engine underneath it ran undetected for 2 years. I met Daisy Villanueva in October, 14 months after the first one ended. By that point, I had given my speech to what I estimated was at least a dozen newly arrived men. I'd given it at bar counters and over breakfast and in the Expat Facebook groups, where men posted about women they'd been seeing for 3 weeks and were already planning a future with. My speech was not unkind. It was practical. It said bar girls are professionals, lonely men are inventory, the warmth is real, and the feeling is real, and it doesn't change what the transaction is. I said this clearly and often, and I meant it with the conviction of a man who had been through the curriculum and understood the material. I was at a bar I went to occasionally, not one of the big tourist operations on the main strip, but a smaller place a couple of streets back that had cheaper beer and a better television signal for American football. I knew the owner, a Filipino man named Bobby who had worked in Saudi Arabia for 10 years and come back with enough money to open a bar and enough stories to keep any conversation going for hours. Daisy worked there. She had been working there for 8 months, she told me later, and she hated every shift of it. The hating it was the first thing I noticed. Not that she said she hated it. She didn't, not at first. It was something in how she carried herself during the work part of the work, the approaching customers, and the drink orders, and the laughing at things men said that weren't funny. There was a faint, controlled distance to it. The way a person looks when they're doing a job they've made a decision to be separate from. I had seen a lot of women in a lot of bars in Angeles City by that point, and they fell into types that I'd categorized, and Daisy didn't fit cleanly into any of them. She was good at the job while being visibly, subtly not of it. That distinction registered as interesting to me before it registered as anything else. I didn't do anything about it for 3 weeks. I went back to Bobby's bar twice in that time, for reasons that I told myself had to do with the beer price and the football signal, and Bobby's company. And on the third visit, Daisy and I ended up talking at the end of the evening, when the bar had mostly cleared out, and Bobby was washing glasses, and the game on the screen had ended. She told me she was from Angeles City originally, that her mother cleaned rooms at one of the hotels on the main road, that she had a younger sister in her second year of community college in Pampanga. She told me she'd taken the bar job after a factory position fell through, and that she was saving to get out of it, not to another bar, out of bar work entirely, and she had a figure in her head, and a timeline, and she talked about it with the specific practical quality of someone who has a real plan, rather than a hope, dressed up as one. I believed her. I want to be precise here. I didn't believe her despite knowing what I knew. I believed her in a way that involved setting aside what I knew, temporarily, because she seemed like an exception to it. And this is the mechanism I most want people to understand, because it's the part the speech never covers. The lesson teaches you to recognize the type. The problem is that when someone doesn't match the type, the lesson stops applying. You've trained yourself to respond to a set of signals, and when those signals are absent, you conclude that the category is absent, when actually, the category has simply changed its surface. Daisy turned down my money the first 3 times I offered it. I offered to buy her a drink one evening, and she said she preferred water while she was working, which Bobby confirmed was true. She didn't drink on shift. I offered her money for a taxi home one night, when she finished late, and I was heading in the same direction, and she said her cousin was picking her up, and she was fine. When I made a comment about a pair of shoes she'd mentioned needing, a careless, passing comment, the kind you make to fill a conversational moment, she said she'd find something at the weekend market for 100 pesos, and that she wasn't the kind of person who needed help with shoes. 3 refusals, over 3 weeks. I tell you this not to say she planned those refusals specifically. I don't know whether she did or not, and I've stopped trying to determine it, but to be honest about what they did to my assessment of her. 3 refusals of money is not a character reference. I know that now. A refusal of money is not the same as not wanting money, and in a certain kind of professional context, it is instead an opening move, a way of establishing a positioning that makes everything that follows feel different from how it would feel if the money had been accepted at the start. What those 3 refusals did, functionally, was tell my brain that she was not what I had trained my brain to watch for, and once my brain had concluded she wasn't the category, every protective mechanism I'd built around the category switched off. We started spending time together in December. Not in the bar, she was clear about not wanting that. On her days off, which were Tuesdays and Sundays. We went to places that had nothing to do with Fields Avenue, a lake north of the city, a market town in the hills, the church in San Fernando that she went to most Sundays, and that I went with her to twice, because I liked the architecture, which is the kind of thing a 63-year-old man tells himself when he wants to be somewhere a woman is going. She talked about her life with a groundedness that I found different from what I was used to in Angeles City conversations. Specific plans, specific amounts, a specific timeline for leaving the bar that she tracked with the practical focus of someone who has been poor long enough to know exactly how much not poor costs. By February, I was in the relationship with both feet and had been for several weeks without formally acknowledging it. That's how these things work, sometimes. You're in before you've decided to be in, and then the decision is retroactive. Gary Stinson noticed before I said anything. Gary had that cop quality of noticing changes in a person's behavior and forming conclusions about them before he raised the subject, so that when he raised it he was asking a question he already knew the answer to. We were having lunch at a place near the main road, and he said, midway through a conversation about something unrelated, "You seeing someone?" I said, "Not the same situation as before." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "You're seeing someone who works at a bar." I said, "She hates the bar." He said, "Barry." I said, "I know what you're thinking." He said, "Good. Then I don't have to say it." I said, "She's different." He looked at his food. He said, "I know you believe that." He said it without irony, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and also the most useless, because I already knew I believed it, and the question was whether I was right, and believing you're right, and being right, are not the same test. Daisy left the bar in March. The conversation happened over 3 evenings. She didn't ask me directly. She told me she'd calculated that she needed another 3 months of savings at her current rate to be done, and that 3 months felt both close and very far away at the same time, and that she'd been thinking about what she could do instead. The sari-sari store she'd imagined, a small convenience shop in her mother's barangay, where the closest one was a 15-minute walk away, and where the market was there if someone with a little capital opened it right. I said, "How much to leave the bar now?" She said she didn't want me to do that. I said, "I know you don't want me to. How much?" She told me. The bar fine to release her from her contract early, the amount she needed to be square with Bobby for the time she'd be leaving, before her informal arrangement ended, the small amount she owed a colleague. The total was $8,000. I asked her to give me the number in writing, not because I didn't trust her. I told myself it was not because I didn't trust her, but because I was organized about money. She wrote it on a piece of paper and showed me, and I photographed it with my phone. I wired the money the following week. She was out of the bar by the first week of April. She brought me a plate of food her mother made as a thank you, delivered to my apartment by Daisy's mother herself, a small, quiet woman named Perla who shook my hand with both of hers and said something in Tagalog that Daisy translated as gratitude. I stood in my apartment doorway holding a plate of rice and chicken and felt, genuinely, like a man who had done a useful thing for a real person. That feeling is important to name accurately, because it was real. Whatever was happening around it, that particular feeling was not a lie. The sari-sari store conversation started in May. Daisy had been spending time in her mother's barangay, she said, mapping the foot traffic, talking to the neighbors, understanding what people needed, and how far they were currently walking to get it. She showed me a notebook with observations in it, actual handwritten notes, dates, times, estimated customer counts, and I looked at that notebook and I thought, this is a real plan. This is not a story about a plan. This is a person who has been genuinely thinking about something and has the evidence to show for it. She needed $15,000 to set it up right. Refrigeration unit for drinks, initial stock, a small renovation to the ground floor of her mother's house where the shop would operate, permit fees. She had a breakdown. I looked at the breakdown. I had enough experience with costs and logistics from my trucking years to know whether a budget for something physical was plausible. And this one was plausible. I said yes. I want to be clear about the internal process here, because I think it's the most important part of this story. When I agreed to the $15,000 for the sari-sari store, I was not ignoring my experience. I was applying it. I was looking at the evidence in front of me, the notebook, the breakdown, the specificity of the plan, and concluding that this was consistent with what I knew about how genuine plans look, as opposed to how pretextual ones look. I was reasoning carefully. The conclusion I reached was wrong, but the reasoning process was not careless. That's the part that stays with me the longest, afterward. I didn't fail to think. I thought carefully and arrived at the wrong place. The store opened in June, and it was real. I went to the barangay on the opening day, and there were neighbors and relatives and Perla's friends from her church filling a small covered space that had a refrigerator unit humming in the corner and shelves of canned goods and condiments, and Daisy, behind a plywood counter, taking money and making change with the focused efficiency of someone who had been planning this for a long time. I stood there and I watched it, and I felt the same feeling as the plate of food on my doorstep, but larger. I had built something useful. I had taken money I'd earned over 31 years on the I-40 and put it into something that was going to make a woman's life different. I drove back to my apartment that evening with the windows down and the warm Angeles City air coming through, and I was in a better mood than I'd been in longer than I could easily identify. Perla's surgery appeared in August. Daisy told me on a Sunday after church, sitting in the small garden behind her mother's house. Her mother had been having abdominal symptoms for several months, she said, and a doctor at the local clinic had referred her to a specialist in Manila who had recommended a procedure, not emergency, but soon, and not available at the local level without a long wait that the specialist had said wasn't advisable. The cost of the procedure at a private hospital in Manila that could do it within the month was $18,000. The public option had a 6-month waiting list. I said, "What's the procedure?" She told me. It was specific and clinical sounding, and I had no medical background to evaluate it with. I said, "Can I see the referral?" She pulled it up on her phone. A document with a clinic header and a doctor's name, and the specific medical terminology I hadn't expected to be looking at in a garden in Angeles City on a Sunday afternoon. I photographed it. I said I'd like to call the clinic to confirm the appointment and the costs. Daisy said, "Okay." She said it without hesitation, no pause, no flinch, no redirection. She just said okay, and gave me the clinic's number. I called the following Monday. A woman at the clinic confirmed that Perla was a patient, confirmed the referral, gave me a general cost range that was consistent with what Daisy had told me. I wired $18,000 to Daisy's account for Perla's surgery. I want to stop here for a moment and say something that I have been unable to say to most people who've heard this story, because it sounds like weakness, and maybe it is. When I made that transfer, I felt good. Not naive good. Not willfully blind good. Actually good. I thought about my ex-wife Pamela, and the health scares we'd had in our marriage, and what it had meant to have money available when we needed it. And I thought about Perla shaking my hand with both of hers with that particular quality of a woman who doesn't ask for things and was being helped anyway, and I felt like a man who was using his life well. Travis called me the following week. He called more often than Christmas now. We'd found a better rhythm in my retirement years, and he asked how things were going, and I told him about Daisy, and about the store, and about Perla's surgery, and he listened in the careful way that sons listen when they're trying to determine if their father is okay, without asking it directly, in a way that would feel like an accusation. He said, "How much are you spending, Dad?" I said it was manageable. He said, "In total, what's the number so far?" I added it up on paper while he waited. The bar exit fee, plus the store, plus the surgery, came to $41,000. I told him. There was a pause. He said, "Dad, that's a lot of money for someone you've been seeing for 8 months." I said, "I know what it looks like." He said, "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just want to know if you've thought about what happens if it doesn't work out." I said I had, which was true. I had thought about it in the way that a man thinks about a thing he's decided to accept the risk of, not avoiding the thought, but housing it somewhere that didn't interfere with the decision he'd already made. Travis said, "Okay, I trust you, Dad. Just keep track of it." I said I would. The sister's tuition came up in October. Her name was Gemma, 20 years old. Second year of a business administration program at a college in Pampanga. The college had sent a notice that the second-year fees were due by the end of the month, or Gemma would have to suspend her enrollment. The amount was $4,200. Daisy said she would figure it out. I said I'd cover it. She said I'd already done too much. I said that a girl finishing her business degree seemed like a useful thing to support. Daisy said she would pay me back from the store income when it was established. I said not to worry about it. I look back at that conversation now, and what I see is the moment when the language shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way I noticed at the time. She had started saying she would figure it out, and I had started saying I would cover it without discussion, and the dynamic between those two things had reversed in a way neither of us named. In the beginning I had been offering, and she had been refusing. Now I was offering, and she was accepting, and the transition from one state to the other had happened so gradually that there was no single moment I could point to where it changed. The rent on the apartment followed in November. Daisy had been living with her mother since leaving the bar, which she'd framed as temporary, and the situation had become uncomfortable. Not because of Perla, who was recovered from the surgery and doing well, but because Daisy's brother had moved back from Manila, and the house was too small for all of them, and Daisy needed her own space to manage the store properly, and to have somewhere to work from. A studio apartment near the barangay was $420 a month. I started covering it in November. By the end of year 1, the total I'd transferred to Daisy's account, or spent on direct costs relating to her and her family, was $67,000. I knew this number because Travis had asked me to keep track, and I had, in a spreadsheet I looked at on the first of every month, and thought about, and then closed, without taking any action. The spreadsheet was evidence I was collecting about a situation I was not yet willing to respond to. That's the most accurate description I have. I was documenting and not acting, which is a very specific kind of self-deception that I think requires a particular combination of intelligence and need to maintain. You have to be smart enough to see what's happening, and attached enough to not want to do anything about it. The second year started well by the surface measures. The store was operating. Daisy was there most days. I visited on Tuesdays, and we'd have lunch at the small table near the counter, while neighbors came in and bought things, and Daisy managed the money and the stock with the competence I'd seen in that first notebook. The store was real. Whatever else was happening, the store was genuinely, physically real, and Daisy ran it with real competence, and the people in the barangay used it, and that part of what I'd built with my money was not a lie. What changed in the second year was something I felt before I understood, a slight reduction in availability. Not absence, nothing as clear as that, but a shift in the texture of the time we spent together, a faint sense that she was more managing our time than sharing it, making certain things available and certain things unavailable in a way that I couldn't point to specifically, but that registered in some part of me that I wasn't consulting. I talked to Gary about it in March of year 2. I said I felt something was off and I couldn't exactly say what. Gary said, "Have you looked at where she actually is when you're not with her?" I said I wasn't going to do that. He said, "Barry, that's not a criticism. I'm just asking if you have the information." I said I didn't have the information, and I wasn't going to go looking for it, because looking for it would mean I already believed something I wasn't ready to believe. Gary said, "That makes sense." He said it without judgment, which I appreciated, and then he said, "When you're ready, let me know," and we changed the subject. I found out in May. Not through investigation, through accident, the way things eventually surface when they're ready to surface. A friend of Bobby's, the bar owner, mentioned to Bobby that he'd seen Daisy at a place in Makati on a recent trip to Manila, a higher-end entertainment bar near the business district, the kind that caters to Korean and Japanese businessmen and charges accordingly. Bobby mentioned it to me in the careful way of a man discharging an obligation he'd been holding for a while. He said he thought I should know. He said he wasn't certain of the circumstances. He said he was sorry. I sat with it for a week before I did anything. I sat with it in the apartment, and at the table where I ate breakfast, and on the evening walks I took along the main road that I'd been taking since my first month in Angeles City, 3 years ago, when everything here was still new, and I didn't know what I didn't know. At the end of the week, I met Daisy for lunch at the store. We sat at the small table, and she had made something for us to eat, and the neighbors came and went, and I waited until there was a quiet moment, and then I said, "I need to ask you something directly." She looked at me. She said, "Okay." I said, "Are you working in Makati?" There was a pause. Not long. 2, 3 seconds. Then she said, "Who told you?" I said, "It didn't matter who told me." She said, "It's not what it sounds like." I said, "Tell me what it is." She looked at the counter for a moment. Then she said, "The store doesn't make enough, not yet. I have the apartment and Gemma's fees and I needed to cover things until the store is properly established. It's temporary." I said, "How long?" She said, "Since January." January, 4 months. I had been visiting the store on Tuesdays through April, while she was also working in Makati, in some capacity I still don't have the full picture of, and the store had been real, and her competence in it had been real, and those Tuesdays had been genuine, and also had not been the complete picture. I said, "I've spent $95,000 in 2 years. She said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand that I'm not angry at you." She looked up at that. I said, "I mean that. I'm not. But I'm done." She said, "Barry." I said, "I'm not done because of Makati. I'm done because I understand something now that I should have understood before, and the understanding is going to require me to do some things differently. That's not your fault. That's mine." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The store is real." I said, "I know it is. I can see that." She said, "I did care about you." I said, "I believe that too." And I did believe it. Both things. The store was real. She cared about me in some form. These 2 things, and the $95,000, and the bar in Makati, all existed at the same time, in the same person, and the discomfort of holding all of them together, without resolving them into a simpler story, is something I am still working on. I walked out of the store and down the barangay lane and out onto the main road, and I called Travis from a bench near a pharmacy. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him what had happened. He listened. When I finished, he said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And I said I was working on it, and he said, "Do you want me to come out there?" And I said no, I just needed to say it to someone, and he was the right person. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I didn't know yet." He said, "You don't have to figure it out today." I said no, but I have to figure something out, because I can't do this a 3rd time, Travis. I cannot do this a 3rd time. He said, "You won't." I said, "That's what I said after the first one." He didn't have an answer for that. There isn't one, really. I've been in Angeles City for almost 3 years now. I'm not going home, or not yet. Home is a Phoenix apartment I sublet to a graduate student, and a city that stopped feeling like mine somewhere around year 27 of the long-haul route, and has never quite recovered. Here at least is warm, and the beer is cheap, and Bobby's bar has good football reception, and people call me by my name. That's more than I had in Phoenix toward the end. What I've been doing, in the months since the bench outside the pharmacy, is something I didn't expect to be doing at 64, which is actual thinking. Not the thinking I'd been doing, which was data collection in service of predetermined conclusions. Actual open-ended thinking about what I was looking for, and why, and whether what I was looking for was something a specific person could provide, or something that was going to keep looking like a specific person and not quite be that. Gary has been useful in this. Gary is the kind of friend who doesn't need you to arrive at any particular conclusion. He just needs you to be honest about where you actually are. And he's been that consistently throughout. I told him about the Makati conversation, and he listened, and at the end he said, "The lesson worked, Barry. You understood it both times. You just decided both times that it didn't apply to you." I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's not a failure of the lesson. That's something else." I said, "What is it?" He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "I think it's loneliness, mate. I think you know the lesson, and you know yourself well enough to apply it, and every time you meet a specific woman who makes the loneliness feel less like loneliness, you reclassify her as an exception, and the lesson goes in a drawer." I said, "That's a pretty clear diagnosis." He said, "You want to know what I think you should do about it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I think you need to get comfortable with the loneliness being just loneliness and not something a specific woman needs to fix. Because as long as it feels like something that needs fixing, you're going to keep finding women who look like the fix." I sat with that for a long time. I'm still sitting with it. The $95,000 is gone. That's $135,000 total if you count the first one, which I try not to do more than necessary, because the arithmetic has a way of becoming its own kind of loop. I have enough left to live on here for a long time if I'm sensible, which I intend to be. The lessons I have are clear. I know them by heart, both the general lesson and the specific one about how the second time doesn't look like the first time. What I'm working on now is the thing underneath the lessons. The thing Gary named. The loneliness that reclassifies people as exceptions. The need that survives its own education. That's harder than the lessons. The lessons are intellectual. This is something older and less manageable than that. But I'm working on it. Honestly, genuinely working on it. Which is more than I can say for the man I was when I first arrived in Angeles City 3 years ago and thought I'd figured out how this place worked. I haven't given the speech since May. I don't plan to. Not because the speech was wrong. Everything in it was right. But I'm not qualified to deliver a lesson I keep failing to pass. And a man who knows that much about himself has at least learned something worth keeping.